if you want to spice up your harmony using diminished chords, it's pretty easy because there's only 3 types of diminished chords. You have the ascending diminished chords, the descending diminished chords, and the auxiliary diminished chords. Let's first start by looking at the ascending diminished chords. Ascending diminished chords resolve upwards by a half step into the target chord. These chords are substitutes for primary or secondary dominant chords. If you look at the graphic here on the top left, this B diminished 7th chord is the origin of diminished chords, and it comes from the 7th degree of harmonic minor. This takes the place of a G dominant 7 flat 9 chord, which would be the 5 chord in relation to this 1 chord. If you take the G dominant 7 flat 9 chord and you remove the root, then the third, in this case B, becomes the new root of a diminished 7th chord that now resolves up a half step to C instead of down a fifth. So that B diminished 7th chord has primary dominant function because it's taking the place of that primary dominant chord. This works the same way for all of the ascending diminished chords. The sharp 1 diminished 7th chord, moving up a half step to the 2 minor 7th chord, takes the place of the 5 of the 2 chord. So if you took the A7 flat 9 chord and you remove that root, then you would have a C sharp diminished 7th chord that resolves up a half step to D minor. The same thing is true of the sharp 2 chord, the sharp 5 chord, and even this sharp 4 chord. Now this last chord here, the sharp 4, is very rare. It's hardly ever used, but it is technically possible. There are alternate resolutions for that particular chord, which I get into in the full episode, and I'll post a link for that at the end. Here's a quick example of what an ascending diminished chord can sound like. Descending diminished chords, which are non-diatonic and non-dominant, resolve to diatonic chords through chromatic resolution and voice leading. The flat 3 diminished 7th chord resolves down a half step to the 2 chord. They share 2 common tones, A and C, and the other 2 tones, E flat and G flat, resolve down by half step. The flat 6 diminished 7th chord works exactly the same way. It's more common to see this chord resolve down to a G minor 7th chord, acting as the related 2 of a 2-5 of the 4 chord, but it can also move to the 5 dominant 7th chord. Instead of sharing 2 common tones, this one happens to share 3 common tones. That's why I don't think it sounds as good and why it's probably not as common as resolving to the G minor 7. Here's a quick example of what a descending diminished chord can sound like. Auxiliary diminished chords are an embellishment of either the 1 chord or the 5 chord and share the same root as well as common tones with the target chord. They resolve through chromatic voice leading. The auxiliary chord on the 1st degree, in this case C diminished 7, can be used in 2 different ways. The first use is to break up a very static couple of bars of a 1 chord. So if you have a couple of bars of just the same 1 chord, you can use this diminished 7th chord to sort of break it up in the middle, so it has a little bit of movement and a little bit of color, and it makes that static 1 chord sound much more interesting. The other use is to delay resolution of the 5 chord. So instead of the G dominant 7 resolving directly to the C or C6, the resolution is sort of interrupted with this C diminished 7th chord. The root of the dominant chord moves down a fifth as expected, and the leading tone, which is B in this case, moves up a half step also as expected. But the rest of the tones of the chord sort of sit in this suspended area where the listener isn't entirely sure what's going to happen, because your expectations of that resolution to the 1 chord were not fulfilled. But then in the next bar, that 1 chord comes in and it feels resolved and your expectations are met. It's a great way to delay resolution and sort of leave the listener in suspense for a bar or 2, and then finally bring everything home and meet the expectations of that 1 chord. And the diminished chord on the 5th degree is just an embellishment or a coloration of the 5 chord. So instead of having a couple bars of a G dominant 7th chord, you break up the one in the middle with a G diminished 7th chord, which then sort of just resolves back into itself as a G7 chord. Here's an example of what an auxiliary diminished chord sounds like. I cover all the scale possibilities in the full lesson on diminished chords, which I'll post a link to at the end, but here's a quick guide just to get you started on some of the general principles. If we take the sharp 2 diminished 7th chord, moving to a 3 chord, remember that takes the place of the 5 of the 3 chord, which is B dominant 7 flat 9. And the chord scale for that would be B mixolydian flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13. If you were going to add diatonic tensions to that D sharp diminished chord, you would end up with the same scale, but starting from the 3rd degree, so that D sharp is now the root note of the scale. This gives you a form of a diatonic diminished scale, which is a diminished scale using diatonic tensions from the key of the moment. So even though we're in the key of C major, if you're resolving a chord, whether it's the dominant chord or the diminished chord, to a 3 chord, you're tonicizing that 3 chord. So your dominant scale and that diminished scale both come from the key of the moment, which would be E minor. For descending and auxiliary diminished chords, you have a few options. If you want the scale sound to have a closer relationship to the home key, then you can use versions of that diatonic diminished scale that we just talked about using that same process. The other option is because they're non-functional, non-diatonic chords, they have that sort of outside kind of sound. So a scale that also has an outside kind of sound might be appropriate. And that brings us to the symmetric diminished scale. Here's the C symmetric diminished scale. It's made up of alternating whole steps and half steps, which is why it's sometimes called the whole half scale. And it's also an 8-note scale, and it's sometimes called the octatonic scale. It has a really great dark, sort of ominous sound to it. And while I wouldn't use it over every single diminished chord, it's a really great scale to have in your repertoire. Now you should be able to start spicing up your harmony using some awesome diminished chords. If you want to dive really, really deep into diminished chords, here's the full lesson. I think it'll be worth your time. Over here, I'll post a link to something else. How about a bucket of sloths, my spirit animal? All right, thanks for watching my very first music theory short. See you next time.